Good evening. I'm Stephen Bartkus, the curator at the Gunn Historical Museum in Washington, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us for a mid-century artist's haven in the early days of the Washington Art Association. We'd like to thank the Washington Art Association for co-sponsoring this presentation. Along with its physical beauty, historic homes, well-tended public buildings, rolling verdant hills, and generations of devoted residents, Washington is known for its lively and long-standing commitment to the arts. This evening, Sarah Griswold, our distinguished guest, and my friend and colleague will explore the social, political, cultural, and historical environment that gave rise to the Washington Art Association's formation in 1952. Jean Solomon, a trustee of the Gunn Memorial Library and Museum, will be introducing her. During this lecture, we ask that you please mute both your audio and video settings. If you have questions, you may submit them throughout the lecture in the chat box, and Sarah will answer some of them at the end. Please note that our next guest lecturer is historian Carol Santalieri, who will present Rossiter's Riverside Retreat on Monday, March 15th, 2021 at 6:30 p.m. Please mark your calendars and register for this presentation, which is being co-sponsored by the Steep Rock Association on the Gunn Museum's website. Now, I'd like to hand it over to Jean.
Hello and good evening. My name is Jean Solomon. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest lecturer, Sarah Griswold, a graduate of the Wickham Rise School as an art major back in what she calls the school's golden age. Sarah is an independent consultant and mentor to cultural and not-for-profit organizations throughout Connecticut. Recent clients include the Institute for American Indian Studies, the Essex Historical Society, Deep River Historical Society, and many others. She is president of the board of Bated Breath Theater Company based in New York and Hartford, and a board member of the Mary and Eliza Friedman Center for History and Community in Bridgeport. Previously, she served as curator of the Gunn Historical Museum and as executive director for the Seabury Society for the Preservation of the Glebe House in Woodbury, Connecticut. Thank you, Sarah, for your participation here this evening. And now I'll hand this over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jean and Stephen. I am so pleased to be here tonight to share what I've learned about the Washington Art Association and its predecessors. I'll always think of the Gunn as my home museum because it was here that I've learned for the first time about museum management and how fabulous the Gunn is and how much I found my calling there. I had known something of Washington's artistic legacy from my time at the museum, but until I was asked to present this short history of the Art Association, I really hadn't put it together. And so this talk is going to be more about the big picture, the context. And I'm going to take away all the boxes so I don't have to see myself. So throughout its nearly 70-year history, WA has evolved to meet the needs of the town and represents one of the best parts of it. Its ongoing tradition of supporting and promoting the arts has engendered an environment that attracts artists, art lovers, and other cultural and social organizations. It has offered classes led by professional artists, reached out to local schools, hosted wonderful parties, offered thought-provoking and innovative exhibits and other programs, and generally enriched the town. Many thanks to the people who have helped me put this program together and have helped it to make it stronger. Washington, the ancestral homelands of the Wiantinok and Putatuk people and their descendants, the Schaghticoke, is a remarkable community with a legacy of longstanding commitment to the to education, the environment, and involvement in the wider intellectual trends, controversies, and affairs of the world, as well as having a long tradition of supporting the arts. The Washington Art Association grew out of a 20th century fashion that started in Connecticut with the 1902 formation of the New Haven Paint and Clay Club. It was followed by associations in Greenwich, Mystic, and Lyme in 1912, 13, and 14. These associations offered an opportunity for artists to exhibit their work locally, often in late summer or early fall, after their outdoor painting season was over and before they returned to their homes and studios, usually in Brooklyn or Manhattan. They also offered an equally important opportunity for artists to socialize and nurture a professional network that they carried back and forth with them to New York. Washington, in 1914, became part of this trend, forming the first such group in Litchfield County. The League of Washington Artists, I can't wait for the Marble movie of that, was founded by Hastings Mowbray, Louis Valiant, Herbert Faulkner, John Fallinsby, and Elizabeth Kempton, among others. They exhibited for 3 seasons before being felled by the challenges of a polio outbreak, the First World War, and the influenza epidemic. However, the League, in its short life, set the stage for the later development of WA. What made Washington such a ripe environment for artists in the late 19th and early 20th century? Artists had worked in the area since the late 18th century, mainly as portrait painters, and had been a presence in Litchfield County as landscape painters since the mid-19th century. They painted in Cornwall, Kent, Salisbury, Falls Village, and Lime Rock, towns served by the Housatonic Railroad, which had opened in 1842. Washington was distinguished not only in its scenic beauty, but by being harder to get to. Although George Washington had passed through New Preston several times back in the Revolutionary War, roads were notoriously difficult in the county, and the town of Washington was tucked away in the hills. That didn't change until 1872, when the Chepaug, Litchfield, and Northern Railroad opened, connecting Washington with New York. But even more than the railroad, what set Washington apart was that these other communities did not have Frederick Gunn. In Washington, nearly everything comes back to Mr. Gunn. Gunn certainly didn't set out to help create an arts colony in Washington when he founded his school in 1850, but it proved to be fertile ground for artistic seeds to grow. One of Gunn's notable students was William Hamilton Gibson, who was born in 1850 and started at Frederick Gunn's school as an 11-year-old. Gunn, himself an indifferent student as a boy, had some novel ideas about education. As a young man, he had read the Transcendentalists widely and was inspired by their ideas about nature and social justice. As well as believing that girls and African Americans could be educated in his school, Gunn also thought that the power of the natural world could be used to educate and discipline his students. Each year, he led a week-long camping trip to Milford Beach, walking the whole school, the 40 miles each way. He also encouraged using the local woods for recreation as well as providing lessons. Gibson was an apt student. After the gunnery, he studied at the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, but had to leave early following the death of his father. He started earning his living in insurance, but soon turned to researching, illustrating, and writing about natural history, eventually going on to be a regular contributor to Harper's Monthly Magazine. His career grew to include becoming a popular lecturer, and he wrote and illustrated numerous lovely books on natural history topics. He lived in Brooklyn, but kept a summer studio and home in Washington, revisiting the landscape, flora, and fauna of his youth at Mr. Gunn's school. He was a close observer, using photography and innovative techniques in his work. Some have called him one of the triumvirate of America's most important nature writers, the other two being Henry David Thoreau and John Burroughs. Unfortunately, unlike them, Gibson's work is no longer as well known. And this is one of his illustrations that is in the collection of the Gunn Museum. And I love it so much. I just think it's wonderful. The background is the raw paper, this sepia colored or ochre colored background. And the way that he uses that to illustrate this wonderful scene is just fantastic. Gibson remains the presiding genius of Washington. This large bronze plaque looks out over the valley that he loved. It rests on the bank alongside Green Hill Road. It is unfortunately often hidden in the brush unless civic-minded citizens like Dmitry Rimsky uncover it. It's easy to overlook it, but it attests to Gibson's influence in the town and the high esteem with which he was held. Another notable student of Gunn's was Eric Kensett Rossiter. A son of the Hudson River School painter, Thomas Rossiter, he graduated in 1871. He became an internationally active architect. By this time, the Chippewa Railroad had opened, and people could make the trip from New York City easily by the standard of the times. And Washington became a destination for the well-heeled. Rossiter designed summer homes and public buildings in Washington for himself and others. And some of his clients here were first introduced to the area when they visited him as guests. Rossiter also purchased the area known as Steep Rock and saved it from being logged, eventually deeding it to the town and paving the way for the formation of the Steep Rock Association. His Washington buildings, many of them grouped around the school and the green, were sensitively sited in the landscape that he had loved as a boy. And the next talk will tell you more about him. And this is the library shortly after it opened. Gibson and Rossiter were the engines, as it were, that brought others to Washington. H. Siddons Mowbray, the subject of an earlier lecture in this series, was a muralist and easel painter who visited Gibson in 1896, shortly before Gibson's untimely death. He had Rossiter build him a house and studio, eventually moving here full-time. As well as being the founder of the League, Mowbray painted the ceiling mural in Rossiter's Gunn Memorial Library building. The building opened in 1908. And incidentally, it housed the historical collection until 1964 when it moved over into the Gunn Museum building. Less well known and of a younger generation, Louis David Valian was born in Cleveland, Ohio. He is believed to have studied in New York at the Art Students League under Mowbray, as well as pursuing further studies in Paris and Rome. Following his father's death in 1895, the family moved to New York. His mother purchased land in Washington, and Rossiter built a family home and a studio, which is pictured here, in 1904. Valian may have worked with Mowbray on mural commissions and as an independent painter. And the family may have come to Washington as a result of that association with Mowbray. Herbert Waldron Faulkner was born in Stamford. He had been living in and painting in Europe, primarily in Venice, where he painted luminous views of the city. He wanted his sons to be educated in the US, and so he sent them to the gunnery in around 1905. A fan of William Hamilton Gibson, he picked up the research on the pollination of flowers that Gibson had been working on at his death and published a book, The Mysteries of the Flowers, which he illustrated. Later, he became a wood carver and did carvings in St. John's Episcopal Church, which Rossiter had designed and Mowbray had decorated. Rossiter built him a house and studio, and he moved here, entering into the life of the town. His paintings in the Mayflower Logbook, now in the Gunn Museum collection, are exquisite and have this wonderful touch of whimsy about them. This painting here is by Faulkner. It's of La Tourelle, Mowbray's house and studio, and designed by Rossiter, as I said. And then this is the back of the library here and the Congregational Church here, which Rossiter redid the facade of. John Fallinsby is best known for his work at the New Hope, Pennsylvania Arts Colony, but he got his start, like so many, at the Gunnery School from 1907 to 1911. He studied art there with Elizabeth Kempton and also with Herbert Faulkner. He married Ruth Baldwin, whose parents had a Rossiter designed home in Washington. Tying the league together with the Washington Arts Association was Miss Elizabeth Kempton, who taught art at the Gunnery for 50 years and is listed in 1952 as one of the founders of WA. She graduated from Pratt Institute in Fine Arts in 1902 and was hired by John Brinsmaid, the second headmaster, where she remained for the rest of her life, dying in her sleep in December 1952. According to the Gunn School archives, she spent many years crafting a book on the art of teaching art, which gave special emphasis to the teaching of younger students. She was also active in the town of Washington, giving summer art classes to the children of Washington, teaching at Wickham Rise, and giving lectures and demonstrations to the Women's Club. She carried on a voluminous correspondence with her former students who were all over the world. And the Gunn Museum has a wonderful little souvenir book that it was an art award for a Wickham Rise student that was given by H. Siddons Mowbray and Miss Kempton. So as William Hamilton Gibson was to this first generation of artists in Washington, so Miss Kempton was in later years. Although as a single woman working in obscurity, her influence was not felt in the wider world. And there are few examples of her work, even at Mr. Gunn's school. And I'm not sure if it's a drawing or a print, is the bridge over the Chippewa into Washington Depot, I think. There are a couple of copies of it, so. Between the railroad and the school, there was a well-established pipeline between New York and Washington. As I mentioned, the League of Washington Artists didn't survive the difficulties of the First World War era. Other communities like Kent and Warren established their own societies, but in Washington, there were no longer formal activities beyond occasional shows. Local economics had changed too. Small water-powered industries were finished and farms were being sold off. The farms were affordable, and with their old houses, barns, and outbuildings were great places to work. An artist could live well in the country with plentiful studio space, the solitude to focus on making art, and an active social scene with other artists. Alexander Calder paved the way, moving to Roxbury in 1933. Kay Sage, an American surrealist painter, brought her husband, the French surrealist Yves Tanguy, to Woodbury in 1941, where they stayed until their deaths in the 50s. David Hare, Sage's cousin, a surrealist and abstract expressionist, moved to Roxbury in the 1930s, where he met Calder, Arshile Gorky, and others. And this painting is by Kay Sage. André Masson, another French surrealist, moved to New Preston for a couple of years in the 1940s. He's photographed here with Marc Chagall. This charcoal, called Paysage du Connecticut, I think can only be New Preston Falls. Marc Chabot says that Chagall, Breton, Ernst, Gorky, and Calder all visited Masson in his home on Flirtation Avenue. Many others came. Robert J. Wolfe, the abstract painter whose ceramicist son Guy is well known and loved by so many of us, or Julianne Levy, the gallerist who came to Bridgeport, or Nam Gabo, the modernist sculptor and Russian exile who moved to Woodbury in 1946. Gabo summed up part of the appeal of this area when he wrote in 1946, "I have to fight alone, but one cannot fight and work in a vacuum. One has to look for those who are spiritually akin to oneself and who feel and fight for the same side. I have come here primarily to show my work, but also in the vague hope of being able to associate myself with a larger cultural body." All of these artists and the many, many other creative people who came here are outside the scope of this talk. But I wanted to note the importance of the internationally known, influential artists who made such a significant impact on the post-war art world. While these people weren't necessarily as involved with the Art Association, they had a profound impact on the people who were, and they provide a sense of the remarkable level of talent that was present. And I hope that someday somebody will look into this more deeply because I think it's fascinating. The Wadsworth Athenaeum had an exhibit of the Connecticut surrealists some years ago, but I think to even look even closer at the Washington connection would be, or the Litchfield County connection would be really interesting. So moving along, I wish I could talk about all the artists involved with the early days of WA, but there isn't time. So I'm going to highlight just a few of the people who were involved, starting with Margaret Train Samsonov, who is one of the most important in getting it started. And most of these images here are, well, many of them are in the collection of the Gunn Museum, like this one. Margaret was the daughter of Arthur Train, a lawyer and author of legal thrillers. Graduating from Bryn Mawr in 1920, she moved to Paris at some point with her first husband, Reginald Ambray, where they studied at the Sorbonne. Her son, John, went to the gunnery school, and her daughter, Jacqueline, went to Wickham Rise. Her New York Times obituary identified her as a painter who had created 1,500 landscapes and portraits. Joan Talbot said that Waugh was the brainchild of Margaret. Margaret felt that there were too many artists in the area not to have an association. As Joan put it, she had enormous energy and drive, and she rounded up all the artists in the area. There was Fedor Rimsky, Bill Sommerfeld, and then there were quite a few who taught at the gunnery. There was Fanny Kempton, Hamilton Gibson, Esther Peck and Alice Snow, Jean Dell, Margaret Titus. Also, there were all this group that had been studying with Faulkner over the years. So there were a lot of people, and she just thought we needed something, a venue. According to Dmitry Rimsky, his father Fyodor, Audrey Scaling, and Margaret Samsonov had conversations about having an art gallery. As Dmitry put it, their thinking was, we should be doing something. We're all here. We're not selling paintings anyway. Dmitry says They suggested having a cocktail party and making an art association. As a student in Germany, Fyodor Rimsky was exiled from his home in Russia during the First World War, and then from Europe as a result of World War II. All of his artwork was lost in the war. He and his wife Petra moved to New York in 1941, where he used his drafting skills, drawing the submarine defenses of New York Harbor, and kept a studio on 10th Street. He worked as an illustrator and commercial artist in New York through the 1950s and 60s. The family bought a house and moved to Washington in 1950, though Fyodor continued to maintain his studio in the city until 1957. Among his many other contributions to the community, he painted the 1959 mural of the old railroad depot that's still on view in Litchfield Bancor's lobby, and someday we may get to see it again. And he participated in the very active local theater productions as a set and costume designer. He was instrumental, not only in the formation of WA, but also to help design and hang exhibits. Audrey Scaling was born in British Columbia and graduated summa cum laude in fine arts from the University of Syracuse, New York. She painted portraits in her early career to make money, though she always leaned toward abstraction. During World War II, she drew maps for the Department of Defense. Toward the end of the war, she married the architect and author Stamo Papadaki and became a part of the international art and architecture world, including among her many friends, Calder and Noam Gabo. She settled with her husband in Washington in 1947, and her work is in the permanent collections of many museums. Bill Talbot's unconventional materials and modernist aesthetic owned much in the war years he spent in Paris, where he studied at the Académie des Beaux-Arts and was influenced by the modernist work of Brancusi, Henry Moore, Calder, and Noam Gabo. He returned to New York in 1946 and met Calder in 1947. A weekend camping at the Calders convinced Joan and Bill to purchase the horse barn and land from Joan's great aunt, who with her sister was an artist who summered in Washington. Bill wasn't interested in meetings and at first declined to be a part of the formation of WA. But as Joan said, one day, Margaret came down the driveway shouting, "Where's that Bill Talbot? I'm having a meeting. I want to have Bill Talbot at the meeting." I said, "He's not around." She said, "Of course he is," and went marching upstairs and got him. Anyway, she got this thing going that way. Talbot's many accomplishments include awards from the American Academy and National Institute of Arts and Letters and the Prix de Rome. His work was praised as being so flawless, one could almost forget their difficulty. His work is represented in the permanent collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art, as well as many others. So the new association had its first meeting at the home of the architect Wakefield Worcester. An exhibit was held in the Worcester barn. The founders were Mr. and Mrs. Wakefield Worcester, Mrs. Boris Samsonov, Mrs. Shirley Dell, Miss Mary Brown, Mrs. Floyd Tompkins, Mr. and Mrs. Stephen Landon, Miss Elizabeth Kempton, William Sommerfeld, William Talbot, Edward Goodwin, Hamilton Gibson, Miss Esther Peck, and Fyodor Rimsky and Audrey Scaling. And there they are. Bill Sommerfeld studied at the Art Institutes League in New York with Max Weber and George Grosz. He spent time in Mexico, where he met Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. A master framer, in New York, he opened a framing business in the 1930s, where he served major artists such as Marc Chagall. He visited Masson in New Preston. He eventually sold the business to devote his time to painting and drawing. His style has been described as moving from impressionism to abstraction. Cat on a Ladder is a painting from the Washington, Connecticut of a longtime American collector, according to the auction website I found. He exhibited at the National Academy of Art, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, and the Carnegie Institute. Bill was an essential member of WA, serving in many capacities, on the board, as part of the building committee, and running the open drawing studio for 30 or 40 years. Previously part-timers, he and his wife moved full-time to Washington in 1978. Esther Peck's father founded the Pomfret School for Boys, and her uncle Theodore was rector at St. John's Church in Washington. After her father died in 1897, Esther moved to New York City with her mother and sister Margaret, where she studied art. Esther traveled extensively, illustrated a book on Mexico, and exhibited and sold her work in New York. She also designed sets and costumes for the neighborhood Playhouse Theater in Greenwich Village. The New York Public Library has some of her designs. A great doll collector, the Met purchased some of her dolls. She moved to Washington in 1920, was a founder of WA, and was curator of the Gunn Museum from 1955 to 1963, where her influence is still felt, especially in the doll collection. And this fabulous watercolor that she did of the horse sheds. I think that's on the green. And I adore this picture. The son of William Hamilton Gibson was a gunnery alumnus. He moved to Washington in 1922 when he was installed as headmaster of the gunnery following John Brinsmaid's tenure there, where he redesigned the campus, the student body, and the pedagogical approach of the school, following 20th century fashions and significantly increasing enrollment. As well as being one of the founders of WA, he was also one of the first trustees of Steep Rock when Eric Rossiter deeded the preserve to the town in 1925. His son Dana, also an artist, served in multiple capacities for WA and was an active and much beloved part of the town. And this is another painting that's in the Gunn collection, which I over the years fell in love with. I just think the more I look at it, the more I see, and it's just beautiful. This is a photo of the first all-member show opening party in July 1952. I chose to include this photo because it gives a good idea of the diversity of work represented, with these paintings by Audrey Scaling, the sculpture by Bill Talbot, two paintings by Helen Watergren, and then Hamilton Gibson paintings, including the one I just showed you tucked away behind here. This is Waldemar Neufeld and Bill Sommerfeld, and also pictured are Paul Brinsmaid, Stephen Landon, and Carl von Gerben. The association then moved to the depot, setting up shop on Green Hill Road in the R.H. Benham drugstore, where they remained until 1954. In the summer of 1954, the association exhibited at the Judea Parish House on the Green. They then acquired the former post office in November 1954. This was right next door to the drugstore, and approximately where Green Hill, where Marty's Cafe is now. This was intended to be the permanent home of WA. Somebody just posted this wonderful picture on Facebook a couple of days ago. And as soon as I saw it, I said, I have to throw it into the show. It's a picture of Washington Depot back probably in 1954 or 55, because it says art gallery here. And it's I'm in love with it. Well, obviously you can see I put all my favorite pictures in this talk. And this is the post office following the renovation. And you can see that it's chock full of people attending an opening. And I don't have time to really get into the social scene in Washington, although I would love to, but this exemplifies that, I think. Everything changed in August 1955. This image shows Main Street, what we now call River Road. Most of the businesses in the depot were located along Main Street and all faced the road. Buildings lined both sides of the street. So this is the now the Washington Liquor Store. This is now the Washington Food Market. And it's so interesting to me, all the shop fronts along here. And you can see one of the buildings on the other side of the street. Flooding in Washington Depot was a nearly annual occurrence, especially in the spring as the ice broke up in the river. When the water receded, people just got to work cleaning up. No big deal. Here's a view of the buildings that would house the first art association during a spring freshet in the 1930s. So the post office here, and it was the A&P, and then the drugstore. Taken in early 1955, this aerial view gives a good sense of the way the depot grew organically in the 19th and 20th centuries. Defined by the Chippewa River, which runs along here, and the Chippewa Railroad, the tracks ran along here. The depot was an example of urban form following function. The buildings were mostly wood. Shops and businesses were on the ground floors and living spaces were above, often occupied by the business owners. And you can see all the 2- and 3-story buildings and how many people were living down here. The town hall, not visible in this view, was designed in 1929 by the architect Cameron Clark. And that building would be the building that would become the Art Association was also designed by him. And that's this little brick building right here. And you'll notice of all the buildings along River Road at that time, only 3 remain. The liquor store building, the food market building, and the former Parks Drug building. And all the rest were either taken down or moved. Everything changed in the disastrous flood of August 1955. 2 back-to-back hurricanes led to debris blocking a culvert in an earthen bridge upriver. The weight of the water and debris were too much for the dam, and it gave way. The Chippewa Valley, so beautiful most of the time, is rocky and steep. The water channeled through this valley, rushed down into the depot, and overwhelmed it. The Association Gallery, just a couple of doors up from the river, was inundated. The devastation was unlike anything this town had ever experienced. But in the spirit of the times and the historical practice, association members just came together and started the cleanup. When the water receded, it was found that many works of art were lost, not only to water damage, but also to being swept down the river. This is the insurance adjuster's list of the missing work and their values. And then these are advertisements for seeking the return of the lost work. And I'm not sure how much, if any, was actually found. It took them 3 months, but by November 1955, the association was ready again and reopened in the post office building. We owe the way the depot looks today to Harry Van Sinderen. After the water receded, some saw it as an opportunity to remake the depot. Town centers were changing in the 1950s. They no longer needed to provide all the services for townspeople, as services and shopping needs were being provided regionally with larger scale business. Sanitation, too, was a major problem, with many buildings emptying directly into the river. Harry spearheaded a remarkable urban renewal project. These old, organically grown town centers were going out of fashion, and new buildings were designed to remedy all of that. They removed most of the apartments above the businesses and provided a uniform aesthetic sensibility and up-to-date septic systems. Dana Gibson said in an oral history that Mr. Van Sinderen had done a lot of negotiating and had got a lot of federal money to go into the reconstruction. He led the drive to redevelop the depot and replace the old wooden buildings with the brick buildings we have today. There was, as Dana put it, a certain amount of back and forth about it. A lot of people just didn't want to have something put in on top of changing the whole depot around. But the depot, which had been mixed use, became a commercial district. And this is a picture of Abraham Ribicoff, the governor of Connecticut, talking with people, viewing the gym building over in the primary school grounds, I think, and then a model of what the depot might look like reconstructed. Knowing that they were going to lose their building, the Art Association started forming plans to relocate. They knew they wanted to be an educational as well as an exhibiting group, and they wanted a local arts center so that people wouldn't have to travel out of town for classes. They formed an 8-person building committee and raised $7,500 for a new building. They planned to put the new building on the site of the current Veteran Senior Center building, but eventually the decision was made instead to put it on the land where the town sheds were and to use those sheds for classes and storage. The first design here by Wakefield Worcester was a handsome building, but estimated at $50,000 was too expensive. The Hearn building, that little architect designed brick building on Main Street, on the other hand, could be purchased for $16,000. Built in 1932, despite being damaged in the flood, it was solid. And pictured here is Fyodor Rimsky, Philip Capel, who was another really important member of the WA, who I haven't touched on, and Bill Sommerfeld, along with Mrs. Paul Kennedy and Mrs. Paul Bruning. This is the site selected for the building. You can see the current Washington Food Market building here with its back to Bryan Plaza. And you can see it was sort of a, once the tracks were, the train was closed and the tracks were taken up around 1948. And it's kind of a forgotten area, and with the fire department building here. This slide shows the building in its original location and then being lifted and moved to the new location. In 1958, a kiln and pottery wheel were purchased in anticipation of pottery classes. Classes had been offered to members in October 1958 for the grandson of $2 for adults and $1 for juniors, with students bringing their own supplies. Printmaking was taught by Philip Capel, oil painting by Dana Gibson, rug hooking by Carl von Gerben, ceramics by Mrs. Lefferts and Mr. Goodwin. George Lawrence Nelson from Kent was to offer critiques at periodic intervals. In 1959, the association held an exhibit at the gunnery while the building was being finished, and it opened to the public at the end of May 1959. The new exhibit, it opened the building with a history exhibit highlighting 300 years called Washington People and Landscapes, organized by Mary Durant Hardwood. Over in Woodbury, the town was celebrating its tercentenary with participation from its 5 daughter towns, of which Washington was one. And I suspect that this exhibit was part of that effort. As you can see, the walls were all dark panel. Joan Talbot said, they put all this pecky cypress around the galleries. Bill and Feodor were asked to put on a show. They said, we can't do it in the dark room. So they bought display paper. They couldn't paint the walls, you see. So they put this paper up as a backdrop for their show. They convinced everybody that the walls really should be white, so they were painted after that. Dmitri, however, tells the story slightly differently. He says that Feodor, Bill Sommerfeld, and Dana Gibson hated the dark walls and snuck in late at night and painted all the walls white without having gotten permission to do so. The Lefferts room, pictured here, was outfitted as a pottery studio. 53 people started classes in oils, ceramic, rug hooking, and drawing. Classes and exhibits were off to a running start. In May 1960, it was reported that 58 works had been sold in the first year of operation, netting $1,807. There were 433 members and 539 visitors to the gallery. Exhibits included a professional artist show, graphic art show, also called the Black and White Show, a juried amateur show, a Daumier show, and in May 1960, an exhibit showcasing internationally famous artists living in or near Washington, including Calder, Joseph Albers, Cleve Gray, Audrey Scaling, William Sommerfeld, Robert Wolfe, Kay Sage, Yves Tanguy, Bill Talbot, and Edward Renouf. Julianne Levy gave a talk. To celebrate the resurgent Wa, the Bal Masque was held in September 1960 at Washington Club Hall. There was a grand costume parade that was to be judged, with the winner taking home an original painting. 200 attended, with the patrons being called a who's who of Washington. Press reported that Bill Talbot transformed the stage into a modernistic setting in scarlet, black, and white, then softened the whole effect with grown birch trees. Fyodor Rimsky decorated the porches in the same vein. Mrs. Thomas Durant, Mary Harwood, and Mrs. Olivia Chapman created gold lights flaring up the wall, and Dana Gibson hung an exhibition of paintings by Washington artists against especially created white walls. Washington Art Association has remained in that little building, expanding and upgrading and continuing to offer classes, exhibits, and a gathering place and showcase for local artists. And nearly 70 years later, it is still a vibrant arts organization, serving not only the town, but now the entire region. So thank you.
Hi, Sarah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to mention a few questions that have come in through the
Sure.
chat room. First of all, I want to say that was tremendous. Thank you so much. That was just so fascinating to learn about some of these artists that did so much. They were so accomplished and so little known. But anyway, Leslie Middlebrook. So she was talking about women and women being allowed to teach at a boys' school. So that seemed like it was something that was out of the ordinary.
I can't really speak to that. There's not very much information about Miss Kempton that I was able to find, but she must have impressed John Brinsmaid, and the students apparently all adored her. So she must have been an inspiring teacher.
Okay. Can you speak a bit about the cohesiveness of the early colony? I mean, these artists that were so talented and had interesting personal histories, but what brought them together? Did they share views in common? Did they influence each other artistically? What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think I'm hoping that people will see this as a start to what I hope could be deeper explorations of this subject. But I would say that these artists all knew each other. I think it was, not a huge community of people. They mostly lived in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and there's a really big Brooklyn connection here in Washington. A lot of people from Brooklyn who had their homes here and summer homes, or their homes in Brooklyn and their summer homes in Washington. I think there were associations and clubs and groups and shows. And so there was probably a lot of back and forth, but also I mentioned Rossiter entertaining visitors. And I think that a lot of people had guests who came up and spent time. The museum has Rossiter's guest book, which is a wonderful artifact with, listing just dozens and dozens of people coming up and spending time and frolicking. Washington is a little different than an art colony like Lyme, Connecticut, where the artists all stayed in a boarding house and developed a kind of cohesive esprit de corps. But I think it was a pretty homogeneous group of people, and especially before the First World War, certainly the fractures that started emerging in the social construct were not at play, and so these men mostly all knew each other, I think.
Can you speak a little bit to the, I guess over time, the town changed, or the artist colony community changed, and it had to do with the fact that Washington was more accessible, and that before automobiles were that widely used or accessible, Washington was a small community, and I had read somewhere, which is interesting, that whenever there was a party, everybody got invited because it was a small town and small group. So with that in mind, it would seem that people had to be close. They had to get to know each other. They had to have some synergy or some kind of connection. So, and then after people had other places to go, people had automobiles, and there was less of that kind of connection and synergy. Did you find that as well?
Well, yes. I mean, it's evident from not just what was going on with the Art Association, but also Drama Lights, which was a a local amateur theater group. I'm sure many here in the audience remember it well. And that grew out of a tradition of making local theater that started in the mid 19th century. The churches were focal points for people. And I mentioned St. John's Episcopal Church a lot because that seemed to really draw people. So it was the small size. It was that there weren't as many cars and people weren't zipping all over the place, especially if you notice the dates of many of the members of the founders of WA. They were from a generation before everybody just jumped in their car and drove over to wherever. So towns were very cohesive. And in the case of Washington and other towns, the villages within the towns had their own identity. So yeah, so people did know each other. And Natalie Dyer and Diana Faulkner Hardy had an oral history that's at the Gunn, and they talked about that a little bit, about the kind of social scene. And also, you know, people didn't just have television or go to the movies or, you know, zip down to New Haven for something. I mean, it's not like they were isolated, but you had to make your own entertainment. And I think people enjoyed it.
Can you speak a little bit further about the connection between the Washington Art Association and the Gunn Historical Museum? I know you mentioned Esther Peck. Were there other connections?
Yes, I did mention Esther Peck and also Mary Harwood. And it wasn't until I started working on this talk that I realized that Mary Harwood was very involved with WA. And then she became the curator up at the Gunn in the early 1990s. And she was actually the person who hired me and sort of took me under her wing, almost sight unseen, which completely changed my life. There were artifacts in that first exhibit in the new building that are in the museum collection. And there are some of the paintings that I showed are in the museum collection. And it was a small town. I think it was around 2,000 people. And there was a lot of, just a lot of cohesion, especially between the Green and the Depot, not so much with New Preston, I think.
So it's interesting. We've got more questions and more comments coming in, but I have to say, it's just been terrific, and I think the comments that I'm seeing are just glowing, and thank you so much. So I would like to say personally, thank you so much. And thank you so much, really, for all of your dedicated research and the time you have put into this, because I know you made this or you created this lecture from scratch, and you did all of this research yourself. So I know the effort that you put into it. And I'd also like to say, I'd like to thank Barbara von Schreiber, who's the executive director of the Washington Art Association, for agreeing to partner with the Gunn Museum in shining a light on an important but lesser known chapter in the town's cultural history, the lives, the accomplishments, and communities of some of its earliest artists. So thank you, Barbara.
And I thank Barbara and WA and all the people who helped me. I talked to a number of people as I was developing this, so thank you. And I just want to say what a pleasure it was to do this, because some of the happiest years of my professional life, possibly all of the happiest years of my professional life, were spent at the Gunn Museum when I worked there with Allison Gilchrist. And just exploring that amazing collection and all the stories of Washington. I have said since I worked at the Gunn that Washington is the secret center of the universe. Many of you have probably heard me say that ad infinitum, but I truly believe it. And it was wonderful to have an opportunity to revisit some of the material that Allison and I explored when we worked there, and the exhibits that we put up, and just thinking about the way Washington is, and what a terrific community this is. So thank you all very, very much.
Well, thank you so much, and thank everyone who has joined us this evening. And I hope you enjoyed it, certainly as much as I did, and I know Stephen. So good night, and thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.